Hello friends, it's wonderful to be with all of you tonight. I am delighted to have this opportunity of chatting with Robert Keay. As you notice in the screen, Robert Keay produced and published this book last October, so it's really close to us in time. So if you want to know more about the book and you want to purchase the book, it's available on Amazon. The only thing that you have to do is go to Amazon and type Reframing the Pandemic. It costs $5.99 for the paperback edition, and if you have a Kindle and you want the digital version, it's only $2.99. The links are going to be below, so you can just click and that will be easier too. Also, I want to announce a competition that we are going to be having. If you want to be part of the competition, it's really easy. The only thing that you have to do is to share this post and tag a friend. At the end of the week, a lucky winner is going to receive a free copy of the book. And not only you, but also the friend that you tag will also receive a book. So if you want to receive a free book, and if you want to give as a gift a book to a friend, the only thing that you have to do is share and tag a friend. At the end of the week, one lucky winner will receive the book. Also, stay until the end of the interview, as you are going to see a couple of things that we want to follow up. If you decided that this is a book that you want to read and you purchase the book or you receive the free gift of a book, we are going to have another sit down with Robert Keay. So if you send me the questions that you have for Robert, my number is again in the description. I will receive all the questions and we'll sit again with Robert and we will have a Q&A. So those are the news, and so without further ado, let's sit and enjoy this conversation, Reframing the Pandemic. Hi, hello folks. We are delighted to be today chatting with you as we are starting a new series when we are going to be chatting with some Christian people, and we are going to be trying to convey some big ideas into a conversation. Today, I am delighted to have Robert Keay with me. And let's first ask, who is Robert Keay? Hi, hello, Robert. How are you?
Hello, Taglay. Nice to see you. I'm doing fine, thanks.
So, Robert, I met Robert at my time in Belfast Bible College, and I really enjoyed my time with Robert. He was one of my lecturers, and I really enjoy his teaching and his insight into the story of the Bible. Both Robert and myself, we have another thing in common. We both marry a Northern Irish girl from Bangor. But Robert, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm in America. I'm an American, currently living in New York. I did my seminary in the United States at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. And when I finished there, I wanted to go to the UK for further studies. And so I went to St. Andrews in Scotland and did work in New Testament there. And while I was at St. Andrews, I met a girl from Bangor in Northern Ireland. She was working at the university, and we ended up getting married. And we ended up moving back to Northern Ireland, where I taught at Belfast Bible College for a number of years before moving back to the United States. So that's our connection, Belfast Bible College and Northern Ireland.
I really enjoy, and I have a secret to confess. I discovered the timing of Robert taking the train to Belfast Bible College. So I changed my schedule to get the same train and ask a lot of questions. And so we have experience doing this. I normally ask not really smart questions, but Robert comes with the goods. So there is some really wonderful news. At the end of last year, Robert published a book, and we are going to be talking about that book. Can you tell us a tiny bit about the background of the book, Robert?
Sure. The book is titled Reframing Pandemic. And the book is an attempt to understand how this pandemic, COVID-19, fits into a world in which God is in control, a world in which God created and God is active. How is it that this pandemic occurred? Why did it occur? How does it fit into God's plans? It seems to me that historians will regard this pandemic as one of the most important things that happened in the 21st century. And it reminded me of previous epidemics in the history of humanity and how the church responded to those things. In the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, there were massive epidemics, and the church responded very positively, and the church grew as a result of that. Well, that made me wonder, how is the church going to respond to the pandemic in the 21st century? Will we respond well? Will this, in fact, be a means of the church growing stronger with greater faith and impact in the world? Or will the church be weakened and devastated by this? And I wanted to see the church grow stronger, more faithful, and align itself with the plans and purposes of God. So I wrote the book for that reason.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. I think that is something that we all are really worried about. We are all worried about, like, what is the situation and in what end of the pandemic the church is going to come up. Are we going to come up alive, or we are going to come up with really reduced numbers? And something that I really enjoy of the book, and I need to point at this point, the book is available for us in the UK and Northern Ireland through Amazon. So there are 2 options. You can buy the physical book or you can buy the Kindle version. It's really easy. You just click, and I am going to put in the description below all the links to get the book. The book is wonderful. And something that I really enjoy of Robert, and I enjoy in my classes, was like Robert always see a continuity, and he doesn't throw facts without backing them up. So something that I enjoy at the beginning, and you start the book talking about Genesis 1 and 2 and creation, but I am going to be silly. I know that in week 1 of creation, we always hear the voice and we read in the Bible that this was good. And in your book, you have this statement that say creation good, but no safe. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very important aspect of the book. When God says that his creation is good, and he repeats that a number of times, we can easily misunderstand that to think that the creation is a completely finished job. But that's not the case, because God created human beings to cultivate the earth and to subdue the earth, to nurture the earth so that it would bring forth all of that which it held in potential. So it held a great deal of potential in it, a great ability to nurture life, sustain life. But the fact that it's able to sustain life means that it has to be very, very powerful. Life requires powers in order to sustain it. And that's why God called humans also to subdue the earth. To subdue something is to harness those powers and channel them in the proper direction so that those powers don't emerge and erupt in dangerous ways, in harmful ways. So the earth, the creation, is very, very powerful. But because it's powerful, it's also dangerous, which is why we have things like earthquakes and hurricanes. Those are built into the nature of the cosmos. We need to have earthquakes because at the core of the earth, there are metals being created, but they need to somehow come up to the surface of the earth for humans to make tools with them. So the earth has to crack and move in order for those minerals and metals to come up through the earth. So earthquakes are part of God's design. But if we're not careful, if we don't subdue that power, then it can also be very dangerous and threatening to us. So it's important that we recognize that the earth is good because it was given by God to sustain and nurture life, but it's also dangerous because the power that sustains and nurtures life can also threaten life. I think that one way of illustrating this is that God gave us powerful oceans, seas, waves churning. There's a lot of power in the sea. The sea is a good thing. It's a good gift from God. If we didn't have seas, we wouldn't have life. Have to have water. But the sea is also a danger in that you can't breathe underwater. You could die if you didn't approach the sea and treat the sea in God's designed way. So the sea is good. The sea is also dangerous. The earth is good. The earth is also dangerous. That's what I mean by not safe. So that's an important beginning element for us to understand the story that we're in. We are in a story in which God has given us a good earth, and he has called us to subdue it, harness it, utilize its powers for good.
That's wonderful. As most people are going to be asking if they are watching at home, I am assuming, and we all know that we didn't do a good job subduing the earth. We got two commanders. We got the commandment of subdue the earth and multiply. We have been excellent in the multiplying aspect, but in the subduing aspect, we have been quite poorly.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are reading the book and we go to the chapter 2, when we're talking about the pandemic, we see that the creation have been broken and is deadly because of our lack of subduing. Can you explain the folks at home, what do you mean by that creation broken and deadly?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how it is that because human beings rejected God's call to them to cultivate the earth, harness the earth, subdue the earth, instead of obeying God, humans decided that they wanted to do their own thing. They preferred things that would perhaps give them an immediate gratification. So they saw this fruit, looks good, looks tasty, looks nice to the eye. I don't really care that God said, don't eat that. I'm going to eat it because it makes me happy. It fulfills pleasures in me. What happens over time is as human beings act out their selfishness, their desire to please themselves rather than God, well, that brings incredible horrors into the world. You see it as the story unfolds with Cain and Abel and murder. You see the story continuing on in Genesis chapter 6, when human beings, because of their selfishness, are just full of evil. Every thought of our hearts is evil continuously, Moses tells us. So take that picture and then continue it for now hundreds and thousands of years, and you see the progress of sin across the globe, where people are acting selfishly and doing things for their own desires rather than according to God's design. And what that has done is it has unleashed all of these powers that God placed in the creation and allowed them to bring destruction and chaos and corruption into the world. So by the time you get to Jesus, you have a world that's completely broken. And you see that brokenness all over the place, particularly so within human beings themselves, as diseases are running rampant. Therefore, Jesus needs to take control over such diseases demonstrate his power as the Son of Man, coming into the world to redeem the world and reclaim the world, restore the world to what God originally intended. And so part of that work is to take control over the diseases, the brokenness, the death and corruption that had invaded humanity. So I tried to picture in those chapters of the broken world just what Jesus was up against. What did the brokenness look like? Well, it looked like people with leprosy and people who were blind and people who were deaf. And it had touched humanity to that degree that Jesus came in to demonstrate that he had come to reclaim, to restore, to redeem. And this healing ministry that he had was a picture of that work. So that's what I was trying to do there.
That's wonderful to point, because in one of the chapters of the book, we get a picture of reality, because we have been idealizing the word of Jesus, and you paint that really clear in the book. Perhaps we get with this picture of the movies, of the cartoons, and we see Jesus in this idea world when everything is nice, everything is soft, but that is completely far from reality. It's a world that is full of sickness, full of virus, and it's a world that is more deadly than even the world that we are living today with COVID-19. And when we think about Jesus, we know, like from kids, when we get asked a question in Sunday school, the answer is Jesus, and we go Jesus. And you know, if you are a kid and your Sunday school teacher asks you something, you say the name of Jesus, and you have really good chances of nail the question right. But why Jesus is the answer, and something that I love about the book, Robert, is that you connect Jesus from Genesis to Revelation. Can you give the folks that are maybe looking, I maybe need to read the book, a quick summary why Jesus is the answer and how Jesus is connected from beginning to end?
Okay. Yeah, I think that we have already talked about the fact that in Genesis, God created human beings in order to, he gave human beings the responsibility to cultivate the creation, to nurture it, to subdue it. And humanity failed in that task. Instead, they became selfish and looked inward instead of obediently towards God. That's key for us, because when Jesus arrives, he arrives as a human being. That title that he uses of himself regularly, the Son of Man, that identifies him as a human being. The importance there is for us to recognize that he came as a human being in fulfillment of what God intended human beings to be and to do. When God created humanity back in Genesis, it was Jesus that he intended humans to be like. We have all failed in that, whereas Jesus does in fact cultivate the world, subdue the world, and necessarily redeem the world and restore it to what God's original intention is. When we move to the book of Revelation, at the end, we see that Jesus has been successful in restoring and redeeming the world, because we get God's restored creation. We get all these images from Genesis once again in the book of Revelation. But what we don't get is all of the brokenness, all of the corruption and the chaos that we saw in the middle period. Now, it's important at this point for me to point out that Jesus, as a single human being, doesn't fulfill the program that God set, because God, in fact, intends for all human beings, a multitude of human beings, to be part of the restored creation, the recreation. So how is it then that human beings who are fallen and corrupt and and dying, how do we participate in that reclaimed, restored, redeemed creation? And at this point, a text in Daniel is supremely important, because in Daniel has this vision in which he sees all of the kingdoms of the world. He sees the kingdoms in their corruption, in their rebellion, in their chaos, led by human leaders like Nebuchadnezzar, other human leaders who are promoting chaos and destruction and death. He sees all of those leaders, those kingdoms, come before God, and they're judged. And then at the end of that story, there comes before God one like a son of man. That is to say, a true human being, a genuine human being, a person that God created them to be. And he gives to that son of man a restored kingdom, a restored creation. So this singular son of man is given the creation because he redeems and restores it. But then the story goes on to say that this singular son of man becomes the saints of the Most High God, from singular to plural. So all of a sudden, somehow in the story, this singular son of man, the kind of human being that God intended, becomes multiplied, and there are many, many sons of men, many genuine human beings. How does that happen? Well, if Jesus is the Son of Man that fulfills Daniel's vision of that singular Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days and receiving a kingdom, then the plural sons of men are those followers of Jesus who unite with him by faith, who identify themselves with Jesus Christ, and therefore number these saints of the Most High God. So that when you finally get to the book of Revelation, it isn't just Jesus who is ruling and reigning over the restored kingdom. It is all of those saints. We rule and reign with Christ. John tells us 3 times that we rule with Christ. We fulfill that picture that was initially given in Genesis of human beings subduing and ruling over the earth, that was fulfilled in Jesus Christ when he came and he initiated the kingdom, but then that is fully completed at the end of the story in the book of Revelation, where we see all of massive numbers of the new humanity ruling over creation. That's the big picture. That's the story of Christianity into which we can fit the pandemic, which we need to fit the pandemic into.
Yeah, when you are talking about fitting the pandemic into, for an average folk in here, when you are talking with other people that are not believers, and even when I try to fit your explanation, is this pandemic and is this COVID-19 a judgment of God because we haven't subdued the earth, because we have failed as a new creation? Or is this a symbol that God doesn't care anymore about us? How is those questions that people are facing, like, is God doesn't care about us anymore, or is this a judgment because we have been sinful? How COVID-19 fit into the meta-narrative and the story of the Bible? Can you help us understand that a bit?
Sure. One of the things that I found most interesting as I did my study and research for this book is that the study of viruses, virology, is a fairly new science. It's a new discipline within the scientific community. And we're learning more and more and more about viruses. In the last just few decades, we've learned a lot about viruses. What we have learned is that viruses are part of God's good creation. We could not have life on this planet without viruses. Viruses are one of the things that sustain and nurture life. But viruses need to be harnessed, controlled, contained in order for them to work well, in order for them to work harmoniously with the rest of the creation. The whole of the cosmos is really a very intricate network of parts, all working together in order to sustain life. If some of those parts fall out of place, then they can become harmful and dangerous. And that's what we're discovering about viruses, that when they're in their proper place, they nurture and sustain life. For example, it's fairly recently learned that human beings are actually full of viruses. Our lungs, for example, have more than 200 different viruses in them that enable the lungs to work and enable us to breathe oxygen that sustains our life. We need viruses. But if a virus leaves its intended habitat and moves to another habitat where it's not intended to live, where it isn't going to do something good, then it becomes very dangerous and can become harmful and can actually hurt its new host. And that's what happened with the coronavirus. It moved from its intended host, which is likely bats. In bats, the virus is a good thing. It enables bats to live well, to live long lives, incredibly long lives. But if it moves from a bat to a human being, well, we're not bats. We're not the proper host. And so it's going to treat us like we were a bat. But since we're not a bat, it's going to actually bring a great deal of harm and ultimately death to human beings. So what human beings, as we are called to subdue the earth, well, that means subduing viruses. That is to harness them, to understand where they belong and make sure they stay within that proper habitat, that proper host. If they move out of that, then we have got to find a way to deal with the fact that they've moved and put them back. So science, God has given human beings brains, an ability to understand the way that God has created the world. He's created it in such a way that our brains can make a connection with the design of the world so that we can understand it, so that we can subdue it, so that we can make corrections in it. When Jesus comes into the world and he begins to deal with the infectious diseases of people with leprosy or malaria, fevers, that kind of thing, what Jesus is doing is demonstrating his ability to subdue, to harness viruses, to restore human beings to their intended design and to put viruses back in their place. That's the image that we get from Jesus and his healing ministry. He's the Son of Man. He's the genuine human being doing what human beings were supposed to do. And now he's calling his followers to do the same thing. That means that science is part of the Christian calling. Medicine is part of the Christian calling. The ability to understand how viruses work, to put viruses back in their place, that's what God calls human beings to do. When he calls us to be scientists and he calls us to medicine, we are fulfilling this calling that Jesus showed us is what we're supposed to be doing and living out. So if we, as faithful Christians, support the sciences, support the medicine, then God will work through us in order to overcome the pandemic and obliterate this virus that has invaded human beings. So Jesus Christ is the answer, because he demonstrates that he is the human being who takes control and subdues the natural world and then calls human beings to follow him in that endeavor. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So for a bloke that doesn't know the story of the Bible and is really frustrated because there is family members that have lost life, and he asks you, why does God allow COVID-19 to happen? How an average Christian can reply to that?
I think that question is part of a larger question, and why did God allow any kind of evil and corruption and disease and death to proliferate within his good creation? That's the COVID-19 is part of that much larger question. And I do think that there are a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is that if God were simply to clean up the mess that humans made, then he wouldn't actually be treating us as the kind of human beings that he created us to be. He would be treating us as little children who he never expects to grow up, to mature, to learn to grow, and to learn how to deal with the problems that arise in the world. We would never mature in the way that God wanted us to mature. Human beings, if you think about Adam and Eve and the initial state of human beings, they had no experience of life. They were extraordinarily immature, who needed to grow and mature and understand one another and the world that they live in. Well, God expects all of us to grow, to mature, to become. If he eliminated all of the challenges as soon as those challenges emerged in our life, then we never would grow. So it's important that we learn how to deal with sin in ourselves, to grow stronger in our ability to handle those challenges. One of the great challenges that we have is handling death. How are we going to handle death? Fact is, God hasn't simply eliminated death. We continue to die. The way that God has enabled us to respond to the reality of death is by demonstrating that he has conquered death. And therefore, we need not fear death. We need not think that death is the most powerful agent in the world that has conquered us, that has defeated us. No, actually, it isn't the most powerful thing in the world. The most powerful thing in the world still is Jesus Christ. He has demonstrated his ability to overcome death so that none of us need to fear dying. So, this is why I think that looking at the earlier epidemics of the 2nd and the 3rd century were so important. Christians looked at the fact that people were dying of epidemics, and they placed themselves in dangerous positions where they would minister to the people that were dying, knowing full well that they may well get that virus themselves and die. But they saw that because Jesus Christ ministered to other people, loved other people, to the point of being willing to die themselves, because death held no power over them anymore. They knew that God would raise them from the dead, welcome them into his kingdom. Therefore, the most important thing was to minister to those who were dying, who didn't know that Christ had overcome death. And so it is that death is something that the Christian needn't fear, needn't worry about, need not be anxious about. Rather, we can continue to march forward, doing what God calls us to do, loving other people, sharing with them that Christ has conquered viruses, death, disease, and showed us how to subdue that. And we can do that because we don't fear death. So that's partly what I would answer. Those two ideas.
That's wonderful. That is a really powerful message and answer that we as a church, I think, are called today, as we were called yesterday, to tell the world about the power of Jesus over everything. And I really enjoy your illustration about the maturity. If we get everything out of us, we will not mature. It's like I'm going to use a really basic example, like the folk that go to the gym. If you don't put weights on that barbell, you are not going to grow any muscle because you are not doing any exercise. So This is an opportunity for our growth. So as we are almost going to a close, the title of the book is called Reframing the Pandemic. And if we are doing a tiny bit of card sales here, and I ask the folk, get this book. It's called Reframing the Pandemic. And this is what the author says about his book. How do you summarize your book in a statement or a wee paragraph?
Okay, thanks for that question. I guess the way that I would summarize the book is that as I considered the pandemic that we were in, I wanted to understand, how does the pandemic fit into a world in which God is in charge? For me, Christianity offers us a story, a history of the world. That is God's story. It begins in Genesis, and the story comes to completion in the book of Revelation. It's a big story. I call it a grand narrative. That's God's story, the world as it unfolds. And what I wanted to do in this book was demonstrate how it is that the pandemic can be understood within that larger story. It fits into that larger story. That's what I wanted to show.
That's wonderful. We are really grateful for your time, Robert, and taking this time to chat with us about the book, about these big questions. For you that are watching at home, please check the link below when we have the books on sale. And another thing, there is going to be a week competition. So for 2 lucky winners, if you share this video and you tag a friend, at the end of next week, there are going to be 2 lucky winners that are going to get this book for free. So please share and tag a friend, because this is something that we are all facing together. And this is something that we all need to be talking, and something that Robert mentioned, and it's really key. I just finished reading the book, and it's really clear how the explanation go. How does God fit into this pandemic? Because we are not on our own. God is at the center. God is in control, and he's going to use this to glorify himself. I am going to use a passage that is not in the book, but something that it came to my mind when we were talking is the passage when Jesus raised Lazarus from the death, and when all the disciples are afraid, and Jesus say, this is not going to be for the end, but for my glory. And I hope that is what we do as Christians, that this is not going to be for the end of us as Christians at the church, but it's going to be for the glory of Christ. So do you have any final thoughts and word for the folks at home, Rob?
Well, thank you, Taglay, for this. It was a lot of fun to discuss this with you. And I hope that people will read the book. And I want them to know that if they have any further questions, I would be happy to get together with you again and discuss those questions and see if we can clarify things. But ultimately, my hope is that the book will enable Christians to be optimistic about the world that we're facing, and also that it will motivate them to follow Christ and to be part of the solution to this problem. Thanks, Dana.
That's wonderful. You check my number, it's going to be there. And so once that you finish the break, you send me the questions and we are going to get together for another chat and maybe reply some of those questions. Until then, we will see you all soon. Thank you, Robert, and we will see you soon.